Good morning, thank you. So before I actually talk about the buyer representation agreement, we talked about copyright issues with photographs. So recent incident, somebody in our office used a picture of Chairman Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve without permission. And there's a company called PicRights that uses web crawlers to search to see if you have inappropriately used pictures that you don't have a license to. So in this specific case, it was true, he did use a picture and then removed it because he received one notification, then a second letter has come. And then it turns out, unfortunately, that they will actually pursue you for costs. So they send a demand letter, in this case, for $700 for the usage of the picture. Good morning. So it's just, once again, a reminder, don't use pictures that you find on the web without written permission or a license to do that. So it's an issue for you. And unfortunately, these people, I thought it was a scam at first, but it's not. They will pursue it. There are some exceptions. If you were to use a picture that you found as a news story, that could be an exception, and there are certain guidelines about that. But for the most part, if you're using it to advertise, I would suggest you don't do it, because somebody may inadvertently find the fact that you have used that picture without their written permission. So anyways, let's talk about the buyer representation agreement. It's similar to a listing contract. That's really what it is, except it's between you and the buyer. Now, eventually, it seems as if the contractual offer of compensation on the MLS eventually can go away. It hasn't happened so far, but buyer representation agreements, I think it's very difficult many times to ask buyers to sign it, but maybe there's some strategies that you can use as we go through it that might allow you to present that type of contract to a buyer and yet not offend them, but still maintain that contractual obligation that you really want, because you're spending a lot of time showing buyers property. So with the buyer representation agreement currently, it just talks about the dates, just like, for example, a listing contract, if it begins April 1st and expires September 30th. That could be the time frame. Now, the default is that the buyer representation agreement is non-exclusive. We'll go into the details of that, but nonetheless, to make it exclusive, you have to check a certain box. So non-exclusive would mean that if another agent worked with them, you still are not entitled to compensation. And there's some exceptions to that. So we don't want to take, for example, a non-exclusive listing contract, because if you don't sell the property, you're not entitled to compensation. If you take an exclusive listing contract, no matter who sells the property, you are entitled to compensation. And then also in section 2, so section 1 talks about the fact that it is non-exclusive, that's the default. Section 2 asks whether or not the buyer has signed another representation agreement, and if they have, they should be disclosing that here. Then section 3, property to be acquired. It's ideal to give as much detail as you can, as opposed to just saying all of California. We don't want to put ourselves in a position that it may not be enforceable. So at least if we don't have a specific location, we can actually say the cities or the counties, and let's give a price range at least. But if you look at 3B, the following specified properties only, you can just list out the addresses also. Or on section 3C, you can identify the properties on a separate list. So I think a range, a price range, say from 750,000 or $1 million to $2 million is probably reasonable. Saying Orange County, that's probably very reasonable, and I would say would be enforceable. But once again, if we say all of California, it's probably going to be contested. And this is always the tough part, section 4, compensation. So there's 3 options that are presented. Right now, section 1 is the default, and that is equal to a percentage. Listing contract, you may, or someone that's offering a buyer's compensation may say they're going to offer you 2.5%. You may consider putting 2.5% in there. Now, they're going to look at you and think, if the seller or some third party is not paying the compensation, am I obligated to pay that? And your answer is going to have to be yes, but maybe there's a different presentation of what we can do. And if we were to look at section 4A2, we can specify a dollar amount, or 4A 3, we could specify maybe a compensation schedule. And why would this be useful? I think we keep running into more and more buyers that are saying, I want you to give me 1% or 0.5% back in regards to your commissions. And they want you to give them something in writing. It's very difficult for us to give a contract that says we're going to rebate to you through escrow 1% of the purchase price. So perhaps, and not only that, but you want them to commit to you. If you're willing to rebate something to them, maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe in the commission schedule, you could say something like, if the compensation offered by the seller is 2.5%, I'll rebate you 0.75%. And if it's 2.25%, 0.5%, and 2%, I'll rebate you 25 basis points. So maybe that's the incentive for them. They want something in writing. You want a commitment from them. You can use this to get that type of commitment and give them the commitment that they're looking for. You can obligate yourself in regards to the rebate on the separate commission schedule if you wanted to do something like that. So that's something for you that only you can make that decision, but it is an option. If you're going to give up money, let's get them under contract at least so they're fully committed to you. There's always going to be someone out there that says, oh, I'll give you more money back. Not that I in any way suggest you give anybody any money. And then any questions about that? And then maybe here's another option, and it's going to make more sense as we go down the form further, but perhaps the buyers are thinking, oh my God, you want 2.5% of the purchase property, or the property I'm going to purchase. That's a lot of money, right? If it's $1 million property, it's $25,000 I might be obligated to pay. So maybe, at least at this stage in the real estate industry, typically commissions are probably ranging from 1.5% to 2.5% offered to a buyer's agent. Is that a fair range? The future, there may not be any compensation offered, but today, good morning, maybe perhaps you say, all right, I'm only going to charge you $1. You're still committed to me, but later in the form, we'll see that the default is that the buyer's agent can retain or keep anything in excess of the compensation that you are going to assure the buyer must pay you. So maybe that's a way to say, hey, you just need to commit to me. And if for some reason something fails or they're not offering anything, I'll accept $1. And maybe this is an extreme example, but it's likely that the selling agent, or excuse me, the listing agent is offering something far in excess of that. So maybe that's another way to convince them to sign the contract so they don't have some type of severe financial obligation to you. Maybe you put 0.25%, who knows? But it's just something to give consideration to. Once again, a negotiating tactic to get them to sign this contract so they understand that regardless, you may be entitled to compensation. So as I mentioned earlier, the contract the default is it is a non-exclusive contract unless we make a specific selection. Non-exclusive would mean that if you are performing certain tasks, then you may be entitled to compensation. So the contract defines that for us. So compensation, and we're looking at section 3B1. No, I could run 4B1, thank you. Compensation is payable only if there is broker involvement with the property. So broker involvement means any of the following. You physically entered, showed the property, you showed the property to the buyer virtually, or you submitted an offer to the seller. And then in addition to that, it further goes on to say that if you simply just send them a list of properties, that is not deemed to be broker involvement, meaning you would not be entitled to compensation. So if you set them up in the client gateway and a property was introduced to them simply through the client gateway, that would not be deemed to be broker involvement. So there has to be some type of active participation on your behalf for this non-exclusive contract for you to document that you somehow introduced this property to them, or perhaps even if they introduced it to you and then you gave them further information on it, or you contacted a listing agent. And then section 4B2, buyer acquisition exclusive representation. paragraph is actually saying, regardless of who sells the property during the term of the contract, you are entitled to the compensation listed in here. And also, the buyer may be obligated to pay compensation to two different agents. It's possible. It's very possible. So now there are cancellation rights within this document, unless you choose other alternatives. But under cancellation of buyer's representation agreement, and this is something that buyers always object to. You mean I can't cancel the contract? I don't like you. I don't want to work with you. I can't cancel. Well, the former representation agreement would not allow them to unilaterally cancel that agreement. Just like a listing contract, neither party, the broker or the seller, can cancel a listing contract unilaterally. So in this case, it's the same thing. But if we were to read this under section 4C1, either buyer or broker may cancel this agreement by giving written notice to the other. The agreement shall be terminated, and this in 4B1 is non-exclusive, by the way. If non-exclusive representation applies upon receipt of the notice, or you can put a time frame. You can say 30 days after receipt of the notice, the contract will be canceled. And then the default is, if it is an exclusive agreement, remember, you are paid regardless of who sells the property. So in that section 4B2, the default is 30 days after receipt of the notice, the contract will be canceled. But you are still entitled to compensation if after the end of the cancellation period, you present to them within 5 days thereafter the properties in which you actually were actively involved in some capacity. Now you actually have, there's going to be a time frame we're going to specify below, which would be a protection clause like the listing contract. Remember, in a listing contract, we can say if we received any buyers that came through and I can identify them during the period of that listing contract, I can give the seller a list of those buyers once the listing contract expires. And if any of those buyers buy the property, I'm entitled to compensation. But you have to specify the number of days, 90, 120 days, whatever the case may be. And that's the same thing here. And that's the analogy I have for you. So you need to give them a written list of those properties. And there is a form that will address that, will help you with that. And then accounting for payments to broker by others. So if you, let's assume you just put 2.5% in there that the buyer must pay. So if anyone other than buyer compensates broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited towards buyer's obligation to pay commission. So if I said under section 4A1, I wanted 2.5%. If the seller's paying 2.5%, the buyer is entitled to a credit equal to 2.5%. So, Mr. Buyer, you have to pay me 2.5%. Seller is offering 2.5% to me, so it's not going to cost you anything out of pocket. Any questions about that? No? Okay, great. So it's 5 days thereafter, right? And then here's the other aspect. If third-party payments received exceed buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be paid to broker. So if for some reason you put 1.5% in section 4, and the amount offered is 2.5%, you're going to receive the full 2.5%. You can check the box. The difference is credited to the buyer if you want. That's also an option. And maybe that's a selling point to get somebody to sign this contract with you. If there's anything paid more, then you may be entitled to a credit without me guaranteeing you any type of a credit. And then authorization to include commission and offer. Buyer authorizes broker to include a term in the buyer's offer obligating seller to pay broker directly or through escrow for any compensation that the buyer owes broker. I forgot which section of the RPA, but I think if you were to use the form number, you can actually, through the RPA, negotiate commissions. If for some reason the seller isn't offering anything, you can ask that the seller pay those commissions. So this is by default giving you the ability to negotiate the commissions when presenting an offer. Doesn't mean the seller has to agree to it, but that is an opportunity for you. Additional broker right to compensation. I'm going to read this first and then we'll go through it. Broker shall be entitled to the compensation provided for in paragraph 4A. So let's say it's 2.5%. If within the calendar days, say 90 days after expiration of the representation period or any extension thereof. So that just means if my buyer representation agreement expires April 1st and I put 90 days in that blank area, I'm protected for 90 more days if any of the buyers I worked with buy a property. So that is a protection clause, good morning, in the buyer representation agreement. And that's true whether it is following a cancellation, because you may agree to cancel. That's very possible. So those are benefits for you also. If you show a buyer property, remember you should within 5 days after the expiration of the cancellation or 5 days following the termination of the contract, present them with a list of buyers that you worked with to protect yourself, and you're entitled to compensation. And if we specify a period out in the future, we say 120 calendar days in section E, then you have that much more protection. Somebody,
in this case, it's the properties you've shown, right? List of properties
introduction. So that's there is something else that's a little more varied, which I don't think I touched upon and I should have. And here it is. So showing the property, submitting the offer, for example. And this is, if you look at the number 1, that's bracketed, broker involvement, non-exclusive representation. So another basis for you to have earned the right to compensation. Let's see, it states the property was introduced to buyer by broker or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on the part of broker. And this is the key part, analyzing the property for buyer. What does that mean? I don't know exactly, but if you've done something more than just set up the client gateway and you've given them additional information on the property, I would suggest that that's analyzing property, and that would put you in the position that you would be entitled to compensation for that property.
So at the end of the expiration of this contract, you would then give the buyer a list of properties that you've shown them or submitted offers on.
Or exactly.
Analyzed one.
Well, you give the buyer a list of all the properties that you were showing to them. That's what you would provide them.
So why were you showing the non-exclusive? Non-exclusive is only if they're also having you as a buyer and another buyer, right?
No, but the reason that I was showing at least part of this is the fact that if it is a non-exclusive representation, well, it doesn't matter if it's exclusive representation or non-exclusive in this case. If something doesn't close during the contract period, but then you had introduced those properties to the buyer, so analyzing the property, showing the property, wrote an offer. So whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive, you would only be entitled to compensation if during that protection period they bought a property. Doesn't have to close during that protection period.
And one of those
they go into escrows, right? One of those properties. Richard, do you have a question?
Yeah, what is it popular? 90 days or 120?
You know, for most listing contracts, I see 90 to 180 days.
So a buyer knows that you have a contract with you for this. They know it, right?
Well, you're going to have them sign it. Yeah.
But they have to understand that, hey, after a period of time, you're going to be.
We're supposed to explain it to them so they understand it. Yeah.
It's better to send them by email or paper, sign them that you received that list of homes that.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. There have been Jay, do you have buyer representation agreements? Do you have them sign it when you're in front of them, or do you have to sign it electronically?
Oh, in front of
In front of them. So Jay does it in front of them.
them. I don't like this.
So you get a receipt, right? That you give it to engineer receipt that you receive.
Well, if you have a signed contract, I don't think you have anything to worry about if they're signing it with their own handwriting.
What's the list of the homes, what I'm talking?
The list of the homes, well, you just need to compile that list.
Doesn't matter.
No, you just need, when you would just send it to them after the end of, within 5 days following the expiration or cancellation of the contract, you just send it to them. And your claim is going to be that I did more than just send you the information on those properties through the client gateway.
If you send them, you're working for them, with them for a while, and you send them many listings
Mhm.
and you show them, but suddenly the agents come into a picture and show something out of those that you sent,
Mhm.
so you're not entitled.
Well, that's a good question. If they show the property, I think it's going to be a discussion over procuring cause in your case. So let's assume you showed one of those properties. But then are you, in a procuring cause case, it's not black and white, but one of the factors would be, are you actively working with that buyer? Well, possibly. If you have a representation agreement, you're going to be assured of being paid. There's no question about that. And the buyer has an obligation to disclose that. So even if you show them the property, they don't work with you and they work with another agent to buy that property. Let's assume it doesn't even go into escrow during the contract period, but it goes into escrow during the protection period. You would be entitled to compensation. That buyer would be obligated possibly to pay the commission for both.
But if you didn't show them that particular property,
Uh-huh.
so you're not entitled.
Well, that's why we're saying this term analyzing the property. What does that mean? Did you give them information about the schools? Did you talk about the property? Or were they just made aware of the property through the client gateway? If it's the client gateway, then you would not be entitled to anything.
This is the form that Jay is filling out, that he
Which-
makes sure that he makes his clients fine.
Jay? Yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes,
Yeah, I just
it
wanna
is,
know what
it
it
is. Yeah, it's been modified from the last form, but, and this one has a few more caveats for what we want to talk about, actually.
Richard, I have a question.
Yes.
So in the point of view representing the buyer, we fill it up this and send it to the buyer if it's agreed with the commission that we entitle for. And we send this along with the offer. That
No.
means,
No, you don't send it to anybody.
so how, the seller can say, no, I don't want to pay that, and or how?
I see.
would you
All right. So
work it?
two different things. It sounds like, so we would not send this form, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, to the seller. What we would do in the offer, we'd check the appropriate box and then the grid, I don't know if it's section 3 or 4 on the RPA, asking the seller possibly to pay additional commissions. Now they're going to be probably, they'll probably object to that, and they can. And actually, since you brought that up, Marco Cho had suggested a strategy to me. Instead of, if in the RPA, could you pull one up actually?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. I think it's helpful when you pull up that section. But that's a good question. I should have been prepared for that. So Carlos is busy pulling up an RPA. When we see the aspect that I'm referring to, it'll be clear, but nonetheless, instead of, for example, maybe asking this, if you're looking for more compensation from the seller for some reason, and the buyer's authorizing it through this form, instead of checking this box on the offer and saying you want the seller to pay more commission, maybe you just ask for a credit to the buyer, and then the buyer could pay the additional compensation that they may owe you. The seller's probably more likely to look favorably on something like that as opposed to paying that nasty buyer's agent more money in commission.
Hey, Rich, I have a question.
Yes.
So talking about crediting the buyer, lenders won't allow you to credit anything that will go towards their down payment. So the only thing you can credit them up to is closing costs, their total closing costs. So what if they negotiate that the seller is going to give them 2% towards their closing costs, and then the lender goes and gives them they buy their interest rate, they pay the interest rate up a little bit, and they get some money back towards their closing costs. Well, at some point, let's say their closing costs are $12,000. and they're getting 10,000 from the two places I just talked about. So the only thing we can do is give them the 2,000 because we can't put money towards their down payment. Correct?
So you're saying the credit exceeds the closing costs?
Yeah, like the
Yeah,
credit.
I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, in the contract that we have them sign, we're like, hey, we'll give you 0.5% back, or we'll give you 1% back. Well, that could be $10,000 on $1 million.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So yeah, the credit is greater than the total closing costs.
Right.
So
So
yeah, I know how to, I'll tell you how to address that. You're under section 5A, it defines that. So in your example, Jim, if you don't address that, your client, your buyer is going to lose that $2,000 differential. But you need to specify when making the offer that any unused credits will use as a direct reduction on the purchase price. So that is the way to even anticipate something like that. Otherwise, yeah, so when you make it, go ahead.
if you lower the purchase price by the $2,000 you still owe them, they're really only saving $5 a month.
Well, that's,
Or
it doesn't matter.
whatever
The point is
that
you're not losing any of the $12,000.
Right.
That's the
Right.
whole key there.
Okay.
And then keep in mind, a lender will allow prepaid closing costs. It could be for, if you have impounds for property taxes and insurance, you can have as much as 8 months impounded. You can prepay insurance. So there's other things you can do actually that they will allow you to cover if you don't want to do that. And the monthly cash flow is more important.
Right.
For the total
Yeah, I'm
cash.
just saying, if it gets to the point where all their closing costs are covered, we still owe them 5,000 from the buyer representation that we sign with them. The only way is to either extend the escrow fees or something of that sort. We can't pay towards their down payment, right?
No, you
Nothing.
can't. You cannot,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Jim. And then if we look at section G3, it says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. So for some reason you wanted the seller to pay the commissions, you could check that box and attach a form. I don't recommend that. I would actually, and this is what Marco Cho had suggested, I thought it was a great strategy. Under section G1, just get a credit from the seller and have the buyer pay the commissions. So the seller is not going to object probably to a credit to the buyer, that it won't cost the buyer anything out of pocket. So that's only if there's some kind of a deficiency in regards to the buyer owing you more money than what is offered by the seller. Let's see, did you take control of the screen?
I did.
Okay.
Well, I had to because.
No, that's fine.
So let me
Thank you.
unshare.
All right. Thank you. My document's pretty good. Right. So here's the ugly part of this form.
Not sure.
Oh, I'm not, okay. Great. Am I not sharing?
Go back to the Zoom icon on the bottom. And share
There it
screen.
is. Thank you. Got it. Okay. So disclosure of anticipated payments to brokers by others. So we have an obligation to disclose to them the total amount when you have this document signed that's being offered. So I don't know how everybody looks at that, but there's a couple of ways to do that. You can use this form, which I would never do. Anticipate a broker compensation. Talk about spelling this out clearly. You're just going to be laying it out there. Your other option is just to send them the MLS listing, the MLS printout. That's your obligation. You probably have you'll have a record of it. You'll email it. And then I'd say for most people, the MLS printout is not necessarily legible to them because it's not something they look at every day like you do. So to comply with your contractual obligation, if you just in advance, if you have a few properties you're showing, send them the MLS printout. You'll be in compliance with this contract.
So the buyer's full report also includes commissions there
The buyer's full report.
from the MLS printout? Because we can't.
You're not going to send that. That's what they're suggesting. You would actually send the agent's printout.
But we're not supposed to do that.
Yeah,
right?
well, here we have advice from I probably would just err on sending it to them as opposed to, you can see in this form, it says this section to be filled, you put the property address and this is how much is being offered to me. And then they sign it.
So there's two forms, you can either send this form or the MLS form.
Yes, and I suggest the MLS agents form, which the commission is going to be found in there.
Not found.
It will be.
Oh, it will be.
It will be. And why would you send it to them? We're going to send it under the pretense, hey, here's all the information on the property. I'd
Is-
include all the pictures too. Someone have a question?
Yeah,
Is the
the-
form good for leases as well?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
The form that you just showed before, that you
Yeah.
put the addresses and the MLS, it works for the commission on leases?
On lease, it would be no different if you have a representation agreement signed. This is only required if you have a buyer representation agreement signed. And yes, that would also apply to leases.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good point, because a lot of times we see $25 or $50 offered on properties by property management companies. And who wants to work for free? They're going to see that property anyways, and they're going to find it on Zillow likely or some other third-party portal. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a good idea to use a representation agreement if you're assisting somebody with a lease. You're helping them locate a property. You're going to put a lot of time in. We'll go back to our form. And then compensation, well, it's earned when something closes, or if the buyer defaults, or if the property, once again, it's just a buyer default. Now, here's the key. This document acts as a demand to escrow. If for some reason they disappear, they ghost you, and you're trying to find them, they may close a transaction without you knowing. And then, of course, you would, once you find out, you would have to sue them, or we would have to sue them. Who wants to go through that? But if you were to find out the escrow that the transaction is open through, you could submit this as a demand to escrow, because it's an irrevocable demand.
So how would you find out?
I don't know.
No, I just see that they-
Contact the listing agent, say, hey, which escrow do you use? I heard they're really, I know you're professional, you probably use the best escrow companies. That would be my guess initially. That's a much easier way to get paid if we can actually find out who has that escrow.
with them.
Yes, because they're going to find it. And then pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreements. It's saying the buyer's obligated to if the buyer has signed another one, they need to notify you. And then broker authorizations and obligations. It talks about everything you need to do. And I'll tell you, if you read this, it really states a lot of the work that you perform and maybe gives them a better idea. And if you're having trouble in regards to your value proposition, use this in terms of all the things you're going to be doing during a transaction. It's a lot of work. Then mediation, if somebody defaults, the parties are required to mediate. And there was one other form. No, that's not the one. So if you find yourself in a situation in which the representation agreement has expired, or you agreed to cancel it, this is a form that you would use to identify the properties that you have introduced to the buyer. So does anyone have any questions? No?
Does this require their signature? This,
Yes, these forms require their
the
signatures.
one that you said the list,
Well,
because if they refuse to.
if they
sign,
refuse to sign it, it does require their signature. But I would say if you send it to them in the same method you have always communicated with them, I think you could probably document delivery if they refuse to sign it.
Because it shows that you sent.
Yeah, it shows that you sent it exactly.
So that's if the contract expires.
If it expires, you would send this, you have 5 days after expiration, or if for some reason the parties agree to cancel the representation agreement. then you would send a list of properties that you introduced to the buyer.
So this is only a contract between you and buyer.
Buyer, correct.
And they should sign this immediately.
The contract itself, yeah, I think before you, the whole idea is to actually begin, create that relationship with them, stress how important it is, because you're gonna be spending a lot of time.
Yeah.
That's a poor presentation on my behalf, but right, you want them contractually committed to you. Now, you could choose, you could just say, non-exclusive if they're worried about that, so you can make it easier for them, but it still puts them on notice.
Non-exclusive. They do
Yes,
not
you're,
want-
we don't want that. We really don't want that. We certainly want an exclusive contract. Richard, you had a question?
Rich. Not rich, Rick.
Rick, I'm sorry.
No problem. Same thing, even though.
No,
is
no,
better.
I get it.
Rich is better. Anyhow, question is, all this that happening in the showing is to protect the agent and also committing closer and closer to the contract.
Yeah, it's your protection. Exactly.
And I lost one of the clients 3 years ago. But I mean, it became friend.
Mhm.
Obviously, before we doing this, we have to show the credibility, what we do, and they go, and then you go for getting the contract, right? That,
Well, I think the whole idea is before you start showing somebody property, you want them to sign this. That's the goal.
so I showed the property 6 months, and finally he called me, and he's an engineer, and he had down payment.
Mhm.
He said, Rick, and we're gonna have a lunch, dinner together. Rick, I just wanna let you know I bought a house. I said, congratulations, I send you all the information. Wondering why, he said, because Redfin gave me $2,000 back.
There you go.
Can you believe this? I said, well, you didn't tell me.
Yeah, there's nothing more painful.
My commission too.
Yeah. That's why this contract would have changed the whole situation
Do we need to
possibly.
Tell them every contract to the buyer that, hey, I'm gonna compensate or no.
Tell them what now?
Tell them I'm gonna give you some back to help you.
You don't have to.
But it's better or no? Why is?
Well, I think they start asking you for money up front, you already know what you're dealing with. If they, and this isn't always true because people don't always understand the value that you bring, but they may just find somebody else who's willing to say, I'll roll over and I'll give you 1% or 2% back. So are you willing to give something back if you have them under a contract? Maybe you are, so because you're protected at least for a period of time. And you know, you're not going to be wasting your time. So there could be a way to get somebody to work with you categorically. If they start asking up front and you're willing to make that concession, then that's the way to do it. I wouldn't do it any other way. I wouldn't say, oh yeah, I'm going to
And
credit
the
you
buyer
money
has
back.
the right to cancel even after the period of time? or
Well,
any-
actually, once it expires, it expires. But if you,
You,
well, it depends how you complete the contract. You could actually specify 30, 60, 120 days after notification. You could do something like that. Or if it's non-exclusive, they can never cancel the agreement. It can only expire.
even, I understand, when you give him notification, but he go with different agent, buy different homes, not the home that you listed or you showed to them. You don't owe anything, they don't owe you any compensation.
Well, if they're still under the contract period and you never showed the property and they buy that property, if you have an exclusive agreement, you're entitled to compensation.
Oh, really?
If you're non-exclusive, then you have no rights to any commission associated with that.
Okay.
We have a question from Jeff. Any word on if and when the seller agent compensation on the MLS will be going away? Months, years, question mark?
Well, I'd say that's going to be dependent upon the ongoing litigation. I would expect that to take a couple of years, but who knows? It just sounds like the industry is going in that direction anyways, possibly. So it's lurking out there. I have no idea in terms of timing. It's a big lawsuit though. An award of what, 1.8 to $5 billion or something like that?
Where does this money go to?
Well, to those that were injured, those that were a party to the lawsuit are probably 40% of the attorneys.
Yeah, I wonder if there was even that much money involved.
Yeah, unlikely. Yeah, I don't believe for a moment, right? Any other questions?
Last question. So as far as expiration for the contract,
Mhm.
it can be for a year.
You can make it for a year. You can do whatever you want.
All right.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. thank you, everybody. Good to see you today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Richard,
Yes.
I'm not still understanding.
I want this one.
When you show homes to the buyer,